Now that we know how to build a web page inside of a browser using JavaScript, and we can do so with a not too tedious syntax like JSX, let's build a very simple React app. When you build an app, one of the things you have to do is design your views. And the traditional way to go about this with React is to look at your views and mentally break them down into nested components. So here we're going to build a very, very simple recipe app that'll display a list of recipes. We can see here 3 recipes we might want to show up in the view. And so we look at this and we visually break what we see down into components. So let's focus in on one particular recipe. So when we lay out a recipe, we'll let the recipe itself be a single component, each recipe component displaying one recipe, and each recipe will break into 2 subcomponents. First, the list of ingredients, and second, the set of instructions. The ingredient list itself will contain even more components, one ingredient component for each ingredient. So let's see how we define and use these components in JSX. The code I'm going through today will all be available in the course's sample code GitHub repo. I have the URL right here, and we are starting with files in the React directory. I've also put a link to this GitHub repo in the comments to the video. So defining a React component is as simple as creating a function that returns a React element. So for example, if I want to define an ingredients list component, all I have to do is create a function and have that function return a React element here. Now, this isn't what we're going to end up doing. I'm just showing you one small piece at a time. But what we have here is create element that creates that UL and puts the li elements in it. Now, of course, as we saw in the previous video, this isn't typically how you put stuff together in React. You use JSX. So that's the second example here where I did that same thing using JSX. Now you'll notice that I've hard-coded all of the ingredients. And again, that's not what we're going to do long term. I just wanted to give the simplest example of a component I could. But to make components really useful, we want to be able to pass parameters into them, so we don't need a separate ingredients list component for every recipe, right? We want one single ingredients list component that can be handed a particular list of ingredients and build the appropriate view. So the way we do that is we pass parameters to these components, and traditionally React calls these parameters props. So let me bring up the next example file here. That would be recipe1.jsx. And this will be the complete recipe app here. Normally you don't stuff everything into one file, but I found that it works a little bit better to go through and make the video. The first thing we have here is the raw data. So data here is an array. The array contains just plain old Java objects. These objects contain key value pairs that describe a recipe, the name, the ingredients, the steps, and so on, right? This is the data that will be passed as parameters to our different components. And I have here 3 recipes: the salmon, fish tacos, and the fruit smoothie. So now let's break this down one little bit further than we did and start with that innermost component, that ingredient component. So the ingredient component is just an li element. So I create a function called ingredient, and because we don't want to hard code the ingredients, we're going to pass the ingredients as a parameter. Conventionally, that parameter is called props. And this props is just a plain old Java object. And so again, this is just a simple return statement with some JSX. We're going to return that li element, and then we'll use those props to add the data inside of that li element. So this particular component expects 3 properties: an amount, a measurement, and a name. So we've broken the ingredients into those 3 separate pieces, and we can insert each one of them with that curly brace syntax. So when we use an ingredient, we're going to pass it a props object, and we're expecting that props object to have a key of amount, a key named measurement, and a key named name that all get dropped into the resulting component. Okay, so the next step out is to build an ingredient list. And again, here I have a component that simplifies this a little bit. This isn't the way you'd write it, but I broke it out a little bit so it's easier to see how all the pieces fit together. So what was the ingredient list? Remember that ingredient list was just a UL with each ingredient being an LI. All right, so I have my function name, I have my props parameter, and so what I'm going to pass in to the ingredient list is an array of ingredients. So I'm going to take that array and put it in a local variable, not because it's necessary for React, but it cuts down on the length of the variable name, so the lines below will fit on the screen. So again, this component is just a single return statement of that UL. Notice I put a class on here this time. And now inside of that UL will be the list of ingredients. So I'm going to use my ingredient component. And I use that ingredient component by treating it pretty much as if it was an HTML tag. So by creating a React component, in some sense, you've created a new HTML element. Don't read too much into that, but syntactically, that's kind of what it looks like. And remember, this ingredient component is expecting an amount, a measurement, and a name. So I need to pass those three parameters. Passing those parameters looks a lot like setting up attributes on an HTML element. So for example, to pass an amount into an ingredient component, I have a key here called amount with the value I want for the amount, a key here called measurement with the value I want for the measurement, and a key called name and the corresponding value. Now, where does this data come from? Well, it's coming out of the array I passed to the ingredient list. So the ingredient list has an array of ingredients, and so I'll take the first ingredient and it will have a property called amount and a measurement and name. Now notice that these names for the data coming in and the data being passed on to ingredient happen to be the same. They don't have to be, but we'll see there's a shortcut that you can leverage if they are. We'll come back to that in a minute. But in any case, so what I have several ingredients in my UL, each one invoking that component with a different ingredient in that array. And one more thing to point out quickly, when you create a list like this with React, where you have a list of components inside of another component, each component needs a unique key. So here I just added 0, 1, 2, 3 as a key. Now, as you've probably guessed, this demo here isn't how you would really write this in a real app. Well, first of all, not every ingredient list has exactly 4 ingredients. Normally when you process a list like this, you use a loop or something, but I wanted to lay it out so it was clear how the properties got set. Let's look at a more typical way of writing this. So here we have our ingredient list. We're going to pass in that props object with our ingredients data. And again, we just have that single return statement. We're putting a UL with a class name on it. And instead of setting up each ingredient component by hand like I did above, I am going to use the map function to create an array of ingredient components. So remember what the map function does is it takes an array of objects and returns an array of different objects. So in this case, it's taking an array of the raw data describing ingredients and returning an array of ingredient components. So this block of code here is what converts the ingredient data, which I called item here, into the ingredient component. And as before, when we create an ingredient component, we have to pass it its properties. So the ingredient component is expecting amount, measurement, and name as a property. And so that the data, the value for that key, comes from the item object. So the amount going into the ingredient just so happens to be the amount value on item. Likewise, the measurement is the measurement value on item, and so on. And again, I don't have to have the same names on both sides. I don't have to have amount here and here. However, they describe the same concept, so it's conceptually simpler just to use the same name. It would be confusing if ingredients measurement was called measurement in one spot and something else somewhere else. Also, if you happen to use the same names on both sides, there's a shortcut you can leverage. We'll get to that later. And then finally, as before, when we create a list of components within another component, they should have a unique key. And so we're setting up the key over here. And the way we get that index is with the second parameter to this lambda. So most of the time when you call the map function, you're primarily interested in the actual object in the array. But if you hand that lambda a second parameter, that just counts through the index in the array 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So that is the ingredient list component with its constituent ingredients. The other component we need to put together a recipe is the instructions, what you do with the ingredients. And so we'll create a component for that called instructions. It will also take a props object, which is the list of instructions. I happen to call those instructions steps. And we're just going to display those steps as paragraphs. So we'll use map again to map each step into a paragraph containing that step. These steps are just text, so we'll drop them in each in its own paragraph. And as before, each of these paragraphs needs an index. Okay, and now we can put that all together in a recipe. And as a quick reminder, a recipe has that header there, plus its ingredient list and its instructions. So that's what we see here. We see that a recipe is a div that contains a header, and the particular value in that header is the recipe's name passed in by the props. And now we have the ingredient list component. And as we saw up here, when we wrote the ingredient list component, we're expecting that it has an ingredients property. So we'll set that ingredients property to the ingredients passed in, and likewise with the instructions. Our instructions expects a steps property, and then we'll grab that also from the props passed in. Now to put this together into a single web page, I added one more component called menu, and this menu will just be a list of the recipes we have. So the menu, which we'll see in a minute, is a HTML section with an H1 title for the page. And here again, I'm using the map to take my array of recipes, which comes in on the props, and generate a list of recipe components. And now the last step is to call the render method, which will take these components that we've defined and built and insert them into the HTML document. Let's take a quick look at the HTML document here. And we can see that we have a div with an ID of main on it. And so what the render method is going to do is instantiate that top level menu component and then drop it into that div element. Notice here that the recipe does take props, and so we'll hand it our raw instruction data, which is then passed down through that hierarchy. Now let's look back at the HTML for just a minute. This isn't the way you set this up in production, but again, we're keeping it simple for our first few examples. So as we've seen before, we're grabbing our React code from a CDN. And because we're using JSX, we also need a way of processing that JSX, which the browser can't do natively. So we're also bringing in some Babel code to transpile that JSX. And then this last piece should look mostly familiar. It's a script tag loading up a particular JavaScript file. You'll notice one different piece here where the type is text/Babel. Now I'm not exactly sure what's really going on under the hood here, but my guess is that this type is not any part of like an HTML standard or anything. My guess is that when we bring in this code, it's looking through the DOM, it's finding a script tag marked text Babel, and then the Babel code itself is taking over the loading of recipe1.jsx. Again, just an educated guess on my part. So now let's see this in action. So I'm going to open up my terminal, and then I'm going to open recipe1.html, and then nothing happens. So that's interesting. Let's see what's happening here. I'll come down and look at the console, and when I do that, I see a cross-origin issue, and I see it says cannot load recipe1.jsx due to access control checks. So again, I'm going to take a little bit of an educated guess here and say the problem is that the Babel code, which is coming from the CDN, is trying to access the local file system. And so since those are two different sources, the security built into the browser is objecting. So what we'll need to do to run this is we'll have to run it through a server rather than just loading the HTML file off the disk directly. So I will launch my Python server. And then I will go grab this file through the web server. And this time it does work. And so we can see our 3 recipes. So there's the header of the menu, and then the menu has 1, 2, 3 recipes. So there's one last thing I want to do before I wrap this particular video up, and that is I want to go back and look a little more carefully at the data. So we've got these components here that display recipes, but let's look at how that raw recipe data itself is formatted. So we can see here that the data is an array of recipes. Each recipe is a plain Java object. So a plain Java object just being a set of key value pairs. So for each recipe, it has 3 keys: name, ingredients, and step. Name, ingredients, and steps, and so on. So the name is just the name of the recipe. The ingredients is itself an array of objects describing ingredients. And the steps are just an array of strings. So now let's go look at this again from the top down. When we built up the components, we built them up from the bottom up. But I think just to make sure everything's tied together, let's look at this from the top down. So the top is the menu object itself. The props that come into the menu are just that raw data itself, that array of recipes. That the props object is going to have a key called recipes, and the value on that key is going to be this whole array of recipes here. So now inside of the menu component, we can refer to props.recipes. Also, I passed in as a prop the title itself. So I've got props.title, that's the string I just typed in right here, and props.recipes, which is my raw recipe data. So this is what generates the title that you see right here. And then the recipes are handled one at a time. Again, I'm iterating through the array, and I create one recipe component for each object in this array here. So this goes into one recipe component, this goes into the next, and so on. So now when we look at the recipe component, what gets passed into each recipe component is name, ingredients, and steps. And those happen to be the 3 components of the raw recipe object here: name, ingredients, and steps. So the recipe component is looking for something called name, ingredients, and steps. So that's what's passed in as the key. And by design, the recipe object itself also has properties called name, ingredients, and steps. Again, it doesn't have to be that way, but why give the same thing 2 different names? It just adds for confusion, and we'll get to that promised shortcut in a future video. And so when we look up to the recipe, now we've got the ingredients that are being handed off to the ingredients list and the steps that are handed off to the instructions. Okay, so now we have a full React app up and running. It's not very big, but at least it's a React app. But some of you may have noticed we still haven't done anything any fancier than EJS. So you may be wondering, well, why are we doing this with React? Why are we pushing this to the client side when EJS would do the same thing? And so the next video will answer that question. In the next video, we're going to introduce state into our React app. And finally, we'll get to see how React apps can behave in a more responsive and snappier way than something you would generate on the server side, like with Rails or Express.